Hello, and welcome back to AQUALIS' Sustainable Water Compliance Summit. In just a few minutes, we'll be joined by our closing keynote speaker, Alexandra Cousteau. My name is Erin Grenz, Chief Development Officer with AQUALIS. I hope you've all enjoyed celebrating Earth Day with us. Today, let me begin on how you can participate in the event. First of all, if you have any technical difficulties during the event, please put your questions in the questions window and our technical experts will help you out. Additionally, we welcome your questions during the event today. We will answer as many questions as possible during the Q&A session that will follow this session, but please feel free to send your questions at any time. To do so, simply type your questions into the Ask a Question window on the side of your screen and hit the Submit button. Also, please be aware that today's event is being recorded, and you'll be notified by email when the archive is available. Now, let me introduce to you today's session's presenter, Alexandra Cousteau, environmental activist, ocean advocate, and storyteller, co-founder of Oceans 2050 and senior advisor of Oceana. Alexandra builds upon more than 60 years of global name recognition to engage people who expect to hear credible environmental information from the third generation of this pioneering family of explorers. For millions around the globe, Cousteau is synonymous with discovery and protection of our natural world. Born into this extraordinary legacy, Alexandra embarked on her first expedition to Easter Island at just 4 months old. By the age of 3, she had already toured Egypt, Tunisia, Uganda, and Kenya, exploring the world in the arms of her father, Philippe Cousteau. Following in the footsteps of her legendary grandfather, Jacques-Yves Cousteau, she learned to dive with scuba from Captain Cousteau himself at the age of 7, immersing her in a lifelong connection to the ocean. Alexandra brings this heritage of adventure and discovery into a compelling modern call to action, inspiring audiences around the world, from policymakers and corporate leaders to students and grassroots communities. With a unique ability to connect with diverse groups, she delivers powerful messages of hope, action, in order to urge us all to join her in the mission to protect and restore our planet's oceans. Welcome, Alexandra.
Hi, Erin. Thank you for having me today.
Yeah, we appreciate you joining us. So today we've heard a lot of different speakers talking about what's going on largely across the U.S., mostly with stormwater systems and our natural watersheds, especially as it relates to some of the catastrophic weather events that we're seeing here in the States, from stronger hurricanes occurring more frequently to the droughts out west and the wildfires we're seeing. I know you had some recent travels going throughout North America and observing watersheds. Can you talk through some of your observations that you saw and just that experience in general?
Absolutely. I took a step away from the ocean and was really interested in looking at how the oceans are connected to the freshwater, going back to the water cycle, something we all learn about in elementary school, and then we'll go off and forget about it. Not our audience today, but I think most people forget that, if you were to pour motor oil into a river in Montana, it would end up in the Gulf of Mexico. And that we are connected across our landscapes and across our watersheds in very intimate ways. But we forget that. And so it was a 17,000 mile expedition across US, Canada, and Mexico. And we looked at the coal ash spill in the Tennessee River Valley. We looked at the Colorado River from the source all the way down to the Sea of Cortez. And of course, the Colorado River doesn't reach the sea anymore. It mostly ends at the Mexican border. A little bit goes over, but it doesn't reach the sea. So we looked at the impacts of what happens when rivers don't meet the sea, and the impacts not just for the communities of fishermen and other people that depended on that ecosystem, but why fresh water is important for ocean life. A lot of species depend on brackish water to be able to spawn and bring in the next generation of that species to the world. And so um, it was eye-opening for me. As you mentioned in my introduction, I come from an ocean family, and our focus was always on exploration, on discovery, on storytelling, on understanding how the oceans were changing, the impacts that had for the ocean, but also for the communities that depend on them. And being able to go inland and go up the river and meet with people there was really an incredible experience. And it gave me so much more understanding for the very real work and the stakes that are present in how we manage our freshwater systems. I was invited to speak in 2010 on an hour-long Fox News report on the water crisis. And this was specifically about the very angry argument that environmentalists and farmers were having about whether water should be diverted from the environment for the farmers, or whether some water should be allowed to flow into the delta for this tiny species of fish called the delta smelt. And that fish only existed there and was protected by the Endangered Species Act. And so there was this very real tension. And I went on this program, and I was sort of the third person. There was a farmer, there was an NGO water leader, and they were arguing about whether the water should go to the farmers or the water should go to the fish. And there was a lot of insults being thrown around. I was getting some of the insults. I hadn't even spoken yet, but it just seemed to me, and this audience would probably have a lot of thoughts about this, but it seemed to me that they were asking the wrong question. That even if we turned the water off for the fish and gave it all to the farmers, that as water becomes scarcer over time and we have to start making decisions about water for the farmers or water for the municipalities or water for industry, that perhaps the farmers would be left without water in favor of municipality. And so this idea that in a changing world where climate change is having impact, and the changing populations of different regions and the demands that go with it, and that we can continue with business as usual, seems very naive. And I think that that's where I saw a common thread across all of these different watersheds that we visited, where we saw people trying to do the right thing, but the systems were built for a different era, and they were straining under new pressures, right? Aging infrastructure, fragmented jurisdictions, climate disruption, all of these things were colliding. But at the same time, we saw real innovation. We saw indigenous communities that were restoring their floodplains, and cities rethinking gray infrastructure and green infrastructure, and in coastal cities, even blue infrastructure. We saw farmers that were adopting regenerative practices, and those weren't just pockets of hope. I think, at least for me, they were signals of what's possible when we stop seeing water as a siloed issue and start treating it as the connective tissue of climate and economy and community well-being, and where we try to look at not who we turn the tap off first when there's scarcity, but how we can all thrive together, and how we can ensure that all the different stakeholders, including the environment, are able to get the water they need to do the things that they need to do, and the environment provides services for us as well. It's not charity. So it was an extraordinary experience, and again, being able to see um, the very important work that our water managers are doing to protect water, not just for today, but for future generations as well, was inspiring.
Um, so let's talk about some of what you observed, right? You know, with the Colorado River, you mentioned it's really not hitting the ocean any longer. Where else did your travels take you throughout North America, and what were some of the observations that you made?
One of the really heartbreaking visits was to the coal ash spill in Tennessee, and I had I wasn't even aware of this practice of taking coal ash, which is really toxic, and storing it in a dam next to the river. And in this case, the dam broke and coal ash spilled into this river. Um, and it destroyed lives, right? People lost their health, they lost their homes, they lost their community, they lost their connection to the place where they raised their children, and they had their own memories, and their family and their friends, and um it became a toxic waste site. And we went and we're looking at all the diseases and cancers and tumors that were appearing in fish. We talked with people who literally couldn't live in their homes anymore. Or if they were experiencing health issues. Their dogs couldn't go in the yard anymore because when they did, they like lost their hair and got sick. Um, and when we went to go talk with the cleanup crew at the coal ash spill site, they told us that coal ash wasn't any more toxic than dirt. Um, Meanwhile, amphibians that are living in coal ash, their fingers dissolve. So um, it was remarkable to what extent the the evidence that this was harming people, like not even talking about the harm to the river and to the biodiversity there, but the harm that came to the people was being overlooked, even by people within the larger community, um, denying that it was a problem, denying that it was happening, um, you know, undervaluing the impact that it had had on families, and and it became really obvious to me when we were there talking with people and trying to understand what was going on, and we made films about this, um, that water is like, it's sort of one of those non-negotiable must-haves in life. The year before I went on the North American expedition, we did a global expedition, and so we were in Israel. We looked at water in Israel and in Palestine. We looked at water in Cambodia, in Australia, in Minnesota. We really looked at it from all angles in terms of how water touches human life, right? For agriculture, for religion, all of these different things. We were in India. And the one thing that everybody said to me, everybody, like the very poor Cambodian woman who lives in a floating village in the Mekong River Delta, to the guy on a kibbutz in Israel, to the Minnesota farmer, they all would say the same thing. They, at some point in the interview, they would say, water is life. And it got to the point where when somebody would say it, my crew and I would look at each other like, there we go again. Like it is one of those um, human, uh, universal human realities that water is our life. It defines the quality of our life. It defines our health. It defines the prosperity of our communities. It defines pretty much most of the really critical aspects of our experience of living in this world. When we don't have enough of it, when we have too much of it, when it's polluted, all of these things can shape the quality of our life and whether or not we're able to pass it on. Places in Lebanon we visited where water was once plentiful and people were raising water buffaloes, and now there is only desert, and people have had to leave, and the people who stay only get water delivered like in a rusty tank once a week, once every 2 weeks. And so it was surprising to me that in a country like the United States, where we do have a lot of wealth and a lot of knowledge and a lot of expertise and a lot of really good people working on these problems, that something like the coal ash spill could happen and be completely unnoticed by, I mean, it was like a blip on the radar screen. I think it popped up in the news for a day or two and then it went away. And it was one of the biggest catastrophic spills in US history up until that point. That there wouldn't be like more preventative measures to make sure that something like this didn't happen, and B, that there would be more outrage that this did happen and that it did, destroy the lives and the homes and the ecosystems that it did. That was surprising to me. But then what was really exciting for me was along the Colorado River, the way communities and NGOs and government on both sides of the border came together to orchestrate the acquisition of enough water rights from stakeholders along the Colorado River to be able to release enough water into the Colorado River for the environment so that that water could reach the sea. And it was, I was there when the dam, opened and the water was released. And grown men were weeping to see water in an environment that they hadn't seen it in since they were children. And they saw all along the Colorado riverbed, even though there had been no water in that riverbed for years and years, if not decades, that the next spring, life came back. Plants came back, animals came back, and in the brackish waters that freshwater release created in the Sea of Cortez, fish were spawning again, and life was coming back. And so that's the gift of water, is that when we manage it well and we manage it for everyone, life can come back incredibly quickly and be literally a gift to people and to animals and especially to future generations. And so when you think about something like compliance, which is it's kind of a dry word, and I think if you went and asked most people on the street if they know what it means, they probably wouldn't. But it often gets framed as box checking, but to me, it's really frontline stewardship. You're holding the line between what's legal and what's livable. And what I noticed was that when compliance is approached as a floor rather than a ceiling, it becomes a launch pad for innovation. And you're the ones that are ensuring that communities have clean water, that it continues to flow, that ecosystems can recover, and that trust in public systems can be restored. And I think right now, trust is one of the most valuable things that we can build. And so if we can reclaim that in water systems, I think the value that brings to our communities and to our trust in one another and the systems that bind us can't be overstated.
You said a couple of, very memorable pieces in those few minutes. And the first is water is life. And that has so many different meanings, right? Because you talk about water supporting life in so many different ways: human life, vegetative life, animal life. And I think, here in the US, as you said, it is a wealthy country, and we sometimes take water for granted, whereas in other parts of the world, they don't have that same opportunity. And so, the audience today is made up of, compliance managers as well as engineers who are working to design sustainable measures that we can think in the future instead of using standards that were created in the early 1900s. And that's been a lot of what the conversation today has been around, right? The environment is changing. Our availability of water is changing. And so, the other thing you said was compliance being the floor instead of the ceiling. And I think that is something that our audience today can take back with them, and really use that in their day-to-day lives and in their careers. So, as I mentioned, we have a few different groups that make up our audience today. We'll start with those engineers who are working to create those sustainable designs for stormwater runoff that eventually gets back into our freshwater systems, that eventually ends up in the ocean. What are some thoughts based on what you've seen around the world that you can offer to them?
Well, I think, designing in the past meant removing water, and I think to a certain extent we see that moving forward, especially in coastal cities where there's a lot of flooding. We want our coastal cities to be dry. And people are thinking about, well, how are we going to keep them dry with sea level rise? How are we going to keep them dry when there's these storm events and these floods and everything? But even there, I think designing for the future means restoring balance. And climate change isn't just increasing volume, it's changing the timing, the intensity, equity of water. And so I see, in coastal places, what's really exciting to me is restoring blue infrastructure, mangroves, coral reefs, salt marshes, being able to buffer coastal cities with those ecosystems. Completely change how the city looks and feels, but it might actually make it nicer to have parks through mangroves and snorkeling in coral reefs, and have more of that natural buffer there that could become kind of a coastal version of a central park, but give really valuable living defense mechanisms to cities against flooding and stuff, creating canals where there used to be streets. Like, I think these are all going to become things that we have to start thinking about in coastal cities. But the same is true in inland cities when we have to increase our tolerance for water coming, having a lot of water come in a short period of time rather than spread out through the season the way it used to be. Like, there's all these changes. And so I think I would encourage engineers to see them not as problem solvers, but as possibility makers, and not to see the solution, not to apply solutions from the past in greater quantity, but to completely rewrite the manual on how we solve these problems using ideas from the future, using new technologies, and really adapting our solution portfolio to problems that we've never had before. Embrace nature and natural systems. Those can be really some of the best frontline defenses that we have. But also questions like, can your system recharge groundwater? Can it support biodiversity? Can it engage local communities? I think infrastructure that just works isn't enough anymore. It has to work with nature. It has to work with communities. It has to work with change. And change is going to become our new normal. Unpredictable will become our new normal. So it needs to be able to expand and contract. And that's where nature comes in, right? That's where, we have an incredible ally. And nature makes people happy. So having more of it isn't a bad thing. Especially if that water is stored in nature in a way that communities can experience and enjoy it. Some places are buffering their cities with mangrove parks. There's all kinds of ways to do this, and I think thinking about those outside the box solutions that have never been thought of before is where real leadership comes in. But I think it's also where you can get communities excited. You can get your CEO, to be excited about the potential of being a leader in new ways. Water management has been around since before the Romans. This is a very old profession, and it's been completely reimagined so many times. The Romans reimagined water management with aqueducts. It keeps getting reimagined. And I think this is one of those moments when we need radical reimagination of something that is absolutely critical to our communities, to our livelihoods, to our health, to our connection to the land and the places that we call home, and the ability of future generations to make a home in the places that we've always made a home in. It's as important, if not more important than the electrical grid. Those are sort of the two things that have to be managed just right, so that everybody can turn on their tap and have clean water, and everybody can plug something into the plug and have electricity flow when they need it. These are critical to our lives. And I just have infinite appreciation for how hard that is. And especially with the challenges that are coming up. I think there are going to be a lot of challenges, but I also think that there's going to be a lot of incredible ideas that completely rewrite how we do this. And that's going to be exciting and fun to see.
I love that reimagination. I think that's great. That's great for our audience. Over the past couple of years, when we posted this summit, a lot of the conversation has been from gray to green, right? For so long, our infrastructure was gray infrastructure, and now we're shifting that focus to green infrastructure, which is truly imperative as we, think through the future of designing these systems. The other group a second group that we have on today's event are, two sets of people. One, compliance managers that are working at the municipal, state, or national level, and then the compliance managers that are working in the commercial or industrial businesses, right? And so they have, two very different jobs that essentially lead to that same thing, is the compliance portion. But what are some of the messages that you would give to them to take back, either to their CEOs or their directors within the commercial industries, or take back to their leaders within the city or at the state level, to have conversations around the importance of water conservation and preservation?
I think that we need to look at water not as just a cost center, but as a risk mitigator and a brand enhancer, and increasingly a license to operate. If you want your leadership to prioritize water, I think you want to speak their language, show how water quality reduces those long-term liabilities, how it strengthens community trust, and helps to prepare for regulatory shifts. But I think you also want to speak to values. well, maybe not every executive, but I think most executives want to lead with purpose right now. And so if we're able to frame compliance as the minimum expression of care, the minimum kind of that needs to be done to have a license to operate, then you can invite them to go further, and you can invite them to consider their legacy, to consider resilience, to consider leadership. Um, but it's because the future is so uncertain. Like, the only certain thing is that things are going to be really uncertain. We don't know how much water is coming at any given time. The seasons aren't really the seasons that we grew up with. Winters aren't the winters we knew. Summers aren't the summers we knew. And that's not just in the United States. I live in France, and we bought a piece of about 10 acres in the countryside, and there's a fairly large pond on that property. And it had been around for generations. It dried out for the first time 2 summers ago when with the drought that we had. And it was carnage. My children were traumatized. We had herons coming, eating all the frogs, and the fish were dying, and plants were growing, and then the water came back eventually, and there was an algal bloom, and then everything died all over again. Like things are happening that never happened before, and you feel those changes, even in like a small example, like the pond on my property, and now it's back. And that's a beautiful thing about nature. It can come back. But I think that with all of this uncertainty, and with the uncertainty that will only grow over time, unless we're able to reduce our emissions and keep it under 2 degrees, those, like, one of the leaders in the climate space said to me the other day, he's like, one day you're really going to miss 2024. And this was during conversation about how crazy the weather was, and the fires, and the droughts and the floods, and all of this stuff that was happening in places where that stuff had never happened. And he's like, it's going so fast. 2024 is going to be like, you're going to wish that it was like 2024, in the next 5 years, 10 years. So I think we can't underestimate how fast these changes are coming. And until we get real leadership at the top to reduce our emissions and try to stem that, we all know a certain amount of climate change is already baked into the system. So we're going to have to also adapt to those changes. And that's where water is really the minimum expression of care for a community. I mean, I've already said this multiple times, but it is life, and we cannot allow ourselves to put it in a position of lesser importance than what it really is, because again, our prosperity, our health, our real estate, like everything is connected to the availability of clean water.
Another audience that we have with us today are students who are just getting ready to graduate university, as well as those who have been in the workforce for just a couple of years. We've heard some doom and gloom today. We've heard some excitement around changes in design and engineering, and how we should be forward thinking. What message would you have for them as they're kind of starting out in their careers in this industry and want to make an impact for future generations for water?
Well, I heard an interesting thing this morning. I was in Monaco this morning. I'm in Paris now. It's always a crazy day for me. But I was at an economist event this morning, kind of a small event on climate philanthropy. And one of the people there said that in conversation with the head of LVMH, which is a billion-dollar French fashion luxury brand conglomerate, that the biggest motivator for them to embrace ESG, like more broadly, and invest more in it and do more in ESG throughout the company, was job applicants who were asking about what they were doing and finding that it was insufficient, and that talent recruitment was actually one of the biggest motivators for them to do more in ESG. And I thought that was so interesting, that I wanted to share it with your students and your young people, because finding purpose in what we do and being able to live a life where the things that we do every day are in alignment with our core beliefs, like how we want to show up in the world, what we want to contribute, who we want to work with, and what we want to leave behind. I think is really important. And I think that not having that contributes to mental health problems. Like we live in a world where there's the plastic crisis and the climate crisis and the environmental crisis, and so many places a water crisis, and being able to go to work with colleagues at a company that shares those concerns and those values and does meaningful stuff to address it, I think is one of the most important ways to be happy. And so to the young people, but to anyone really, I think never lose your sense of purpose. There's so much that you can do. We need young people to inject purpose, creativity, ambition, vision, and a desire to just get stuff done. I know we need it in the ocean space and in the climate space, but I think in any space there's just so much room for that kind of energy. And if you go into your job interviews and you really ask questions about what's being done, and it can be hard at first when you join a company to navigate how that company operates and how you can bring more ambition to what they're already doing. But by making that a priority, you're sending a really important message to recruiters and to companies about how they're going to be able to get good talent, and what they're going to have to do to make sure that the next generation wants to work for them. And I think it's a fantastic motivator. And I think it's one of the really powerful things that you can do, is to just hold on to that desire to live in alignment with your principles and your values and what you want to contribute, and keep going where those people, where you find your tribe. Because it can be hard, and having a tribe is really important. People who share your values and want to make change happen with you.
I want to open up questions from the audience. So for any of those listeners out there, please submit those. But you're in front of numerous leaders every day, whether that's from the private sector or the government. And one of the questions that came in is it possible to instill some care of the environment from those major polluters? And so what are some avenues that you've taken in your career to address some of those concerns?
Um, it's it's a hard question. That's why I'm taking a moment, Erin, to think about it, because what makes people care is such a hard question to answer. We've been trying to figure that out in the ocean space for like 50 years. every time we think we found something people are going to care about, they don't care. So, you know, in 2018, people started talking about plastic pollution in the ocean. And there was all the stuff that was being done to address it. People were doing cleanups. They were seeing plastic containers on the beach that they had in their kitchen. There was like a direct correlation, and people didn't want to see their beaches be polluted, and they didn't want to go to the beach and have plastic trash everywhere there. And I thought maybe like this is one of those things that will help us to address the plastic crisis, you know, and increase recycling rates. Only 9% of plastic is recycled, like that can get people to sort their, you know, like I just thought it would, and that it did lead to some, but not really enough. And so now, you know, like the plastic advocates are looking through their player, like, what can we talk about now? And then now the science comes out that you have microplastics and nanoplastics all throughout your body, in your reproductive organs. It turns out it's in your brain. There's like the equivalent of a plastic spoon's worth of plastic in your brain because it can cross the blood-brain barrier. And so we're all wondering, like, will people care now? Because they found that it can make you more likely to have dementia. It can lead to cancers. Women are giving birth to children who are pre-polluted with plastic. Like, are people going to care about it now? And I don't know. Like, I honestly can't tell you, like, if that's enough to make people take action. So how to make people care? I mean, I think people care about the places that they call home. And I've seen more action for people, you know, in their own communities to take care of something like that than anything else. And so this is where people start NGOs sitting around their kitchen table and make friendships happen and feel good about cleaning up their local river. And you know, I met a retired couple. They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary by planting rain gardens for all of their neighbors to clean up the little river that went through their neighborhood. And that was the money, like they used the money they would have gone on a cruise with to do that because they wanted to leave a legacy. And it ended up becoming something that inspired other communities who asked them to go and help them do the same thing. And on the day of their anniversary, they had a bluegrass band and an ice cream truck and a food truck. And they had all of this dirt brought in, and it was just a party. And that's because they cared about their home, right? That's what they cared about. They weren't doing this on the other side of the country, on the other side of the world. And they weren't sending $5 checks to the WWF. Like, they were doing something for their home and for their neighbors. And they saw an immediate return on investment. So I think that when it comes to water, your biggest argument is always going to be home and protecting our home, protecting our children, protecting the quality of life that we want to pass on to our children, just like we invest in a university fund, just like we save money to take them on vacation or send them to a good school. We need to invest in their future, and that future needs, and I saw somebody said water, food, and shelter. You know, our access to water, our access to healthy food, our access to home is going to become more and more of a question mark in the future. And I think that's where we can get people focused back on those things. We can create a lot of change because the stakes are high now, and they're just going to keep getting higher. So I find that framing it that way has been the most successful way to get people to care.
One of our audience members also commented that it really takes greater awareness, right? And that's why everyone showed up today, is because everyone wants to take something from this conversation, and from what they learned today back to their regular lives. But it requires all of us to take action instead of just listening and hearing. Last year when we had this summit, we talked a lot about PFAS and microplastics, and we're just learning more and more every day. But there does need to be action taken, or it's not going to stop itself.
Yeah. And that's where, Erin, we all have, there's things that every single one of us can do. And it can start at home with the products that we buy and the way we sort our trash, but it can also be at work, with the ways that we inspire people to pursue bigger ideas and do more. Oftentimes it's kind of scary to stick your head out with a big idea. What if it goes wrong? I might lose my job, or, I might not get that promotion, but I think that there's the other side of that coin is the opportunity for leadership. And there's enough case studies now that we can look to those case studies for inspiration and for new ideas, and see how we can implement them in our own communities. The pioneers have kind of already blazed a trail, and I think there's a lot more that we can do following in their footsteps, and still being ahead of the pack. And that's sort of a really interesting and exciting place to be. You're not taking all the risk. There's already been other people who've sort of trailblazed these ideas, but there's not critical mass yet. And so that's an interesting place to be, because you can take lessons from others, reformulate them for your own situation, and play a leadership role in scaling them up. And that's cool. And that's a really important thing to do.
Yeah. And another individual said something similar, right? We're in this kind of transformative space right now where we need to move forward. We can't, be using the information from the early 1900s to give us design information for today. And, maybe taking risks and getting a little uncomfortable is necessary in order to drive some of the change that's required.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what being an explorer is, right? And we all know exploration's never easy, but that always contributes to the greater good.
Well, I think we are out of time for today. For any questions that we didn't answer, we will get back to you via email. And on behalf of AQUALIS, I'd like to thank you, Alexandra, for participating today. We really appreciate your time. I know it's 10:30 at night where you are, so appreciate you hopping on after a day of travel to join us.
It's my pleasure, and best of luck to everybody listening. What you guys are doing is really important, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for joining today. I hope you found today helpful in your day-to-day pursuit of ensuring clean, fresh water for generations to come, and discover new practices to add to your toolkit. If you'd like to review any session today, you can access this event for the next 6 months at this site, or you can visit aqualisco.com to watch today's sessions and those of years past. This concludes AQUALIS' Sustainable Water Compliance Summit, and happy Earth Day to all.